Welcome to the debate. Imagine, for a moment, trying to map the intricate, swirling currents of an entire ocean. You are watching a trillion individual drops of water moving simultaneously, shaped by wind, temperature, geography.
Right, a massively chaotic system.
Exactly. Now imagine that the water itself is watching you back. And the moment it realizes you are mapping its path, it changes direction.
Yeah, and worse, imagine presenting that inherently flawed map to a ship's captain. You give them, complex mathematical coordinates, guaranteeing them a safe voyage right before they steer directly into a massive, unpredicted hurricane.
Well, today, we are exploring a discourse that emerges from a really fascinating series of briefings. They critique the limits of macroeconomic models, the over-reliance on metrics like GDP, and, the public's obsession with aggregate economic indicators.
We're basically looking at the epistemic status and the scientific validity of modern macroeconomics.
Right. The central question before us is this. Is macroeconomics a vital, if imprecise, framework essential for managing complex global economies and preventing crises, or is it an overrated expert priesthood that hides behind a facade of hard science while failing to deliver reliable predictions?
Which is a heavy question.
It is. And I hold the position that macroeconomics, while imperfect and operating under extraordinary complexity, is an essential tool for statecraft and crisis management that is vastly superior to guesswork.
And my position is that macroeconomics is fundamentally an intellectual illusion, suffering from physics envy, operating with a terrible predictive record, and relying on flawed aggregates that completely obscure human reality.
So when we talk about macroeconomics, we really have to begin by acknowledging the staggering scale of what this discipline is attempting to do. I mean, we are not talking about observing a controlled chemical reaction in a laboratory here.
No, definitely not.
The field is trying to understand a global system composed of billions of independent, mostly irrational actors making trillions of simultaneous decisions every single day. People buying coffee, corporations deciding where to build factories.
Central banks managing reserves?
Yes, all interacting in real time. And yeah, the discipline has predictive limitations. It is not an oracle. But what it provides is a crucial high-level map for understanding international linkages, inflationary dynamics, and long-term growth. We really cannot forget its undeniable historical successes. Sites of modern central banking helped us avoid a repeat of the Great Depression during recent financial shocks. We actually understand the mechanics of financial contagion now.
Do we, though?
We do. We understand the conditions that create hyperinflation precisely because of this field's analytical frameworks. Without this aggregate view, we would be flying entirely blind. We would be returning to the rigidities and the catastrophic policy paralysis of the pre-macro era. It is an imperfect defense, absolutely, but it is our only structured defense against total systemic collapse.
I hear that, but the problem is that this defense operates with an aesthetic of science without the actual epistemic substance to back it up. Modern macroeconomics is heavily draped in the language of physics.
What do you mean by draped?
I mean, it uses, differential equations, formal proofs, Greek letters. It does all this to confer an aura of performative rigor. It dresses profound, sweeping speculation in a costume of absolute certainty.
I wouldn't call it a costume.
But it is, because it makes it far harder for the public and, more importantly, policymakers to question it. In any other hard science, a model that systematically fails to predict massive inflections would just be abandoned. But look at the mechanics of the 2008 financial crisis.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective on this issue of predictive failure. Demanding perfect foresight from macroeconomics is essentially like expecting a meteorologist to predict the exact path of a single raindrop in a thunderstorm.
That is quite the analogy.
It fits, though. The economic system is embedded in entirely unpredictable political, psychological, and ecological contexts. When a model fails to predict a massive, unprecedented shock, a black swan event, like a global pandemic or an opaque subprime mortgage collapse, it isn't necessarily negligence.
But it is a structural failure.
It is an honest reflection of genuine, perhaps insurmountable difficulty. A physics model works precisely because gravity doesn't have a psychology. An economy does. The fact that the models struggle with massive shocks doesn't erase the intellectual achievement of understanding how a localized credit freeze shutters trade markets globally.
But the comparison to meteorology is much too generous. The weather doesn't change based on the weather forecast. And this gets to the absolute foundational flaw in the discipline's internal logic, which is the Lucas critique.
Ah, yes. I was wondering when we would get to Lucas.
We have to because it explains the exact mechanism of why the models break. Human beings are not molecules in a physical system. We are adaptive thinking agents.
Right. Expectations change.
Exactly. The models look at historical data to find correlations, right? But the Lucas critique points out that the moment a central bank announces a new policy, based on that data, individuals and markets instantly change their behavior to anticipate it. The historical correlation becomes completely obsolete the second the policy is implemented.
But the Lucas critique is precisely why the field has evolved over the last 40 years. Modern economists don't ignore adaptive expectations. They explicitly attempt to incorporate them.
By using extreme simplifications like rational agents and equilibrium states, which they know perfectly well do not reflect how actual humans behave. They map a static world that simply does not exist.
Well, all models require simplifications. A map on a 1-to-1 scale is just the world itself. That is completely useless for navigation.
But if the map tells you there's a bridge where there's actually a cliff, it's worse than useless, it's dangerous.
We use the rational agent not because any macroeconomist actually believes humans are perfectly rational calculators who maximize utility at every waking second. We use it because it provides a necessary mathematical baseline to measure real-world deviations against. Even an imperfect model is vastly better than relying on pure political intuition when you are trying to cool inflation.
I come at it from a different way. The danger isn't just in the mathematical assumptions or whether they fix the equations after the fact. It's in the metrics themselves. The macro lens views the world from 30,000 feet.
Okay.
And in doing so, it mathematically flattens millions of unique, lived human stories into a single, deceptive metric. This is the tyranny of the aggregate. Take the specific analogy from the source material. If a billionaire walks into a local diner, statistically, the average wealth of the people in that room just skyrocketed.
Average is obscure distribution, yes.
Right. The room is incredibly prosperous on paper, but the waitress pouring the coffee remains exactly as poor as she was a minute ago. And this is what macroeconomics does on a national scale every single day. It routinely masks severe regional misery behind stellar national averages.
That is a fair critique of averages, but
Let's go deeper into the actual accounting. Look at GDP, gross domestic product. It is the ultimate macroeconomic idol, but it merely measures the velocity of money. It suffers from a fatal flaw called the satiation blind spot.
which means it doesn't account for quality of life.
Exactly, but look at the mechanics of how it fails. If a massive hurricane completely levels a coastal city, GDP can actually receive a massive boost.
Because the loss of the homes isn't deducted from the ledger?
Yes, the billions of dollars spent on emergency services and buying drywall all count as economic activity. The metric treats a catastrophic loss of human well-being as economic growth simply because capital changed hands to fix a broken window. When you manage a nation using a dashboard that registers a devastating hurricane as a positive growth event, your instruments are actively misleading.
That's an interesting point, though I would frame it differently. I don't think any serious economist believes that an aggregate average captures the full distribution of wealth, nor do they think GDP is a moral indicator.
It certainly acts like one in the media.
Maybe so, but if you were managing a nation of 300 million people, you absolutely need a dashboard. You cannot steer a ship without instruments, even if those instruments only tell you part of the story. Aggregate indicators are required to manage broad, structural trade-offs.
But if the trade-offs are based on flawed metrics,
Let me explain why we need those metrics, though. Take the Phillips curve, the observed historical trade-off between inflation and unemployment. If inflation runs too hot, the cost of groceries skyrockets. That acts as a massive regressive tax on that very same diner waitress you mentioned earlier.
true.
We need macro-level data, flawed as it might be, to realize when the aggregate economy is overheating so the central bank can cool it down. The thermometer doesn't tell you if a room is aesthetically pleasing. It just tells you the temperature. The metric itself isn't tyrannical. It is our public over-reliance on it as the sole measure of human flourishing. That is the issue.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why. You cannot neatly separate the metric from its application in the real world. Macroeconomics operates within a massive force field of ideological interest.
A force field?
Yeah, because these economic findings dictate real-world resource distribution. They determine who gets what, who benefits from a multi-trillion-dollar stimulus, and who suffers under severe austerity. Therefore, it is impossible for the field to remain objective.
I think questioning the objectivity of an entire discipline is a really heavy claim.
Let's look at the mechanics of the Washington Consensus in the 80s and 90s. This was an intellectual monoculture. Macroeconomists looked at debt crises in developing nations and confidently prescribed a one-size-fits-all mathematical solution.
Severe privatization and austerity.
Right. Immediate deregulation, strict fiscal austerity. The models assumed perfectly liquid markets would just naturally correct the inefficiencies, but they applied this to real nations without robust safety nets. The mechanics failed entirely, causing mass unemployment and social collapse.
The Washington Consensus was undoubtedly flawed in its rigid application, and economists debate it fiercely today, but
Let me just add how this scientific status is artificially maintained. It is essentially laundered by the Svarex-Riksbank Prize, which the media persistently and incorrectly refers to as a Nobel Prize.
it is awarded by the Royal Swedish Academy, though.
Sure, but the framing does enormous ideological work. It provides an unearned hard science prestige to theories that are practically dubious. Furthermore, the funding for think tanks and prominent journals often comes from wealthy interests who have a direct stake in research that supports deregulation-heavy policy conclusions.
I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning because you are conflating the scientific enterprise with the political transmission mechanism. Let's separate the economic analysis from its political implementation.
But they are completely intertwined.
Not necessarily. When a macroeconomist provides a nuanced, data-driven recommendation, say a highly targeted fiscal intervention, that recommendation does not become law by magic. It must pass through a hopelessly compromised political process.
But the economists know that process exists.
They do, but they don't control it. The economic theory gets transformed, diluted, and packed with pork barrel spending by politicians acting purely on short-term electoral incentives. By the time the policy actually hits the real economy, it barely resembles the original model.
So it's always the politician's fault?
When the resulting policy fails, society instantly blames the macroeconomic theory. But that failure is actually a reflection of a dysfunctional political system, not necessarily the underlying economic mechanics. There are thousands of researchers operating in good faith, entirely regardless of who is funding a particular think tank in Washington.
If we accept that, if the models are this structurally limited by human adaptation, and the political transmission mechanism is as hopelessly corrupted as you just described, where does that leave the average person?
Navigating a complex world, as always.
Right, but the translation of these macro theories into public life has created a deeply damaging psychological effect on the individual. The briefing calls this the macro agency gap. Think about how much mental bandwidth the average person wastes doom scrolling over national interest rate hikes or global trade flows.
People naturally worry about the economy.
But they are agonizing over variables they have absolutely zero control over. Evolution wired human beings for small-scale, local reasoning. This constant exposure to aggregate top-down thinking introduces a deep psychological fragility. Instead of waiting for an expert priesthood to fix a broken machine, individuals need to reclaim their agency by focusing entirely on their micro-citadel.
I love this concept. Explain the mechanics of the micro-citadel for us.
It's about radically shifting your focus to the micro-variables you actually control, your specific, actionable skill set, the strength of your local, physical network of friends and colleagues, your personal savings rate. These are the walls of your micro-citadel. A robust micro-citadel can survive and even thrive in a completely mediocre macro environment.
It shifts the focus back to the individual.
Exactly.
When we frame every single societal debate in macroeconomic terms, talking constantly about growth and aggregate demand, we completely exclude the individual's lived reality. We train people to be passive observers rather than actively building resilience in their own backyards.
I have to admit, the framing of the micro citadel is brilliant. It is incredibly empowering, and I completely agree that individuals should not base their daily emotional happiness on the fluctuations of a quarterly GDP report. But I must push back here because your micro citadel is ultimately built upon the foundation of macroeconomic stability.
It's built to withstand the lack of it.
Only up to a certain point. Let's look at the mechanics of a true macro collapse. You can cultivate your local network, you can save diligently and build your skills, but if the macro environment completely collapses, if we experience a hyperinflationary spiral that wipes out the purchasing power of those diligent savings in weeks,
Which happens?
right? Or if the banking system structurally freezes the way it nearly did in 2008, so that your local ATM literally stops working, the walls of your micro citadel will be breached. You cannot plant a thriving, resilient garden if the entire continent is on fire.
But the argument isn't that the macro environment doesn't exist. The argument is that the experts steering the macro environment do not possess the precise control they claim to have to prevent those fires. And therefore, your safest bet is localized resilience, not blind faith in the dashboard.
Which is exactly why the field absorbed that massive failure in 2008 and developed entirely new frameworks for understanding systemic risk. It studies its own failures, it learns, it is a human institution desperately trying to mathematically understand another vastly complex human institution.
It adapts by retrofitting mathematical explanations to past crises while remaining structurally blind to the next one. We are dealing with an incredibly complex adaptive system. The aspiration to model it with deterministic precision requires simplification so radical that the model and the real economy share almost nothing but the name.
So we just give up the models?
We stop prioritizing these abstract national metrics over our lived realities.
Let's draw our perspectives together here. From my point of view, this discussion highlights that macroeconomics is dealing with a task of almost unimaginable complexity. Yes, its mathematical models are simplifications. Yes, its predictive record is visibly flawed when it comes to black swan events.
Very flawed.
But despite all of this, it remains an absolutely necessary defense against systemic collapse. The answer to the limitations of macroeconomics is not to abandon the field or dismiss it as an illusion or retreat entirely into our micro-citadels. The answer is calibrated uncertainty. We must proportion our confidence to the actual reliability of the data.
And my summary is that the discipline must be immediately stripped of its unearned scientific hubris. The mathematical performance obscures a reality that is far more speculative than factual. By acknowledging these deep structural flaws, the tyranny of the aggregate, the absurdity of metrics like GDP that register disasters as growth, we can begin to view macroeconomics for what it truly is.
An imperfect tool.
Just one imperfect lens among many. It should sit alongside sociology, history, and psychology, not above them as a hard science. We must stop waiting for an academic establishment to fine-tune our prosperity.
It seems we have found a significant area of convergence today around the crucial need for epistemic humility. We both agree that aggregate economic indicators should never be treated as divine truth, and that the discipline is frequently, and sometimes disastrously, weaponized by political interests.
We also agree on the psychological toll this takes on the public. Individuals should definitely not outsource their peace of mind to a central bank spreadsheet. That micro-level agency is essential, regardless of whether you view the macro models as vital maps or elegant hallucinations.
It is a profound tension. We are caught between the undeniable necessity of top-down aggregates to manage a highly interconnected global society and the fundamental reality of bottom-up, individual choices that actually compose that society.
It really forces us to ask what we are actually optimizing for. Are we building an economy that looks perfect on a mathematical model, or are we building an economy that actually serves the human beings living within it?
A powerful question. We leave it to you, the listener, to determine how much weight you should give to those macroeconomic headlines the next time they flash across your screen.
There is a great deal more to explore in our source material, particularly regarding how sociology and economics intersect to shape our daily lives.
Absolutely.
Think back to that vast, unpredictable ocean we started with. We may never be able to perfectly map every current or predict the path of every drop, but we are all still out here navigating the waters together.